Okay. Yesterday, strangely, a couple images popped up on Facebook. The same line, but in two different images from Martin Luther King Jr., because this was, I guess, his birthday was celebrated this last week. But I don't know why suddenly yesterday this showed up. But it reminded me of the sermon a couple weeks ago when we looked at the theme of justice in the book of Isaiah and how that's a value to God. And again, it's not just in Isaiah. You can find that theme throughout Scripture. But it just, this caught my attention because this could come almost straight out of Isaiah. In fact, it probably did. I think his mind was saturated with Scripture. But he said, we need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. So that was just a simple reminder of that importance of justice and what God is looking for and what God values, and certain kinds of human appearances are less valuable to God than we might place on that, whereas we need to learn what God values and begin to adopt those values for ourselves. But this week, we're going to look at Isaiah 25 to 27. So that's three chapters. Actually, in Isaiah 24 to 27 is kind of a unit. It's a section that most scholars think go together. We're going to focus on these three chapters. Don't worry too much. Just because it's three chapters doesn't mean it's going to be an extra long sermon. I hope not, though I think last week it got a little long, so I apologize for last week's sermon. August said there wasn't a fire, so who cares? But anyway, that's August. But in my effort to try to, help us to find things in Isaiah that are usable, this is kind of what I want us to look at in these chapters. First, I want us to look at the problem in two images. Okay, two particular images that are here that kind of point us to the problem. I mentioned at the beginning of Isaiah that Isaiah is going to diagnose our problems, humanity's problems. It's going to be like a doctor. It's going to be uncomfortable, but he's going to point to what needs to be fixed. So we're going to look at two images in these chapters that kind of remind us of the problem that's going on. And then we're going to look at hope in two images. And then finally, the resolution or the response that we see in two particular responses. There's nothing magical about two. There's actually more images in these chapters for some of these, but in order to keep it simple so you can kind of hold on to the basic ideas, I'm going to focus my thoughts in this way. I'm not always so organized, but so anyway, we're going to just kind of look through what is the problem and what is the hope that is offered in these chapters, and then how can this be resolved, and what is our role in reaching up to the hope that God is offering. And if you've been reading through Isaiah and listening to the sermons, I hope by now you've heard some of the same things, and you might even think, didn't Mark preach that sermon 4 weeks ago? And possibly I did, because that's what Isaiah did. He cycles through the same kinds of themes, whether it's judging this nation or mentioning this sin or that, or this response. It's, in order to understand Isaiah, we need to see what kinds of things are emphasized through that. So I hope some of this is going to sound familiar, and I hope what I'm going to say today will help you as you continue to read through Isaiah to understand, this all links up very well. Before we look at these three sets of two images, I just wanted to put up for you three of the texts that I find especially helpful to summarize what's going on in Isaiah. And so if while I'm talking on and you get bored with what I'm saying, then that's okay. Just look up here and you can read these verses to yourselves. You can tune me out, and you could do much worse this morning than to read these texts. But these are, I think, really, at least these spoke to me from this particular section. In chapter 25, Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and give thanks to your name. For you have worked wonders, plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. That word plan is going to come up, especially when we get to the last part of Isaiah. It's going to just constantly be reminded what is happening according to a plan. History has not fallen out of God's control. The nations are not out of His control, and things are, unfolding according to a plan that God has in mind. God's plan. It's God's plan, and God is going to be faithful to that plan. God's plan is for good, and God is faithful to that. And when Paul comes to write the book of Romans, Paul's mind has been just completely saturated with Isaiah. If I believed in reincarnation, I'd almost think that Paul was a reincarnation of Isaiah. But Paul is all about the faithfulness of God. The book of Romans, the gospel in Romans, is about God being faithful. What God said He was going to do, He's faithful to that, and there's going to be lots of times when it looked like He isn't faithful, like God has changed His plans. And Paul is saying in Romans, God never changed His plan from the beginning of time to the end of the story. God is faithful. And Paul gets that from Isaiah. And then the second text, it will be said in that day, behold, this is our God, for whom we have waited, that He might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let's rejoice and be glad in His salvation. And I don't know, how Isaiah might have first presented this, but I assume, especially based on the vision that Isaiah had of God, when Isaiah says, this is our God, he's like, this is our God. What could be possibly better than this, more powerful or beautiful than this God? What if we could present a picture of God so that people, wherever they are in their beliefs, are like, I don't even know if that God exists, but I wish there were a God like that. I wish God were like that. Wouldn't that be amazing if God were like that? And if we could present God and then say, this is our God. Don't you want this God? How could there be another God that could possibly match this God? This God is our God. And there's no need to be ashamed of our God, to be embarrassed of what He does, if we can understand who He is and communicate who He is. Then finally, the steadfast of mind you will keep in perfect peace, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. So in any case, if you want to meditate on those verses instead of on my message, feel free to do that. But first, let's look at these two images that Isaiah is going to give of the problem. And the first one I want to look at is in Isaiah chapter 27 and verse 9. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. Isaiah is talking about the judgment that has come and is coming. God's people and the nations around them are going to be suffering God's judgment because of their sin. And so Isaiah talks about that warfare and exile. It's like this hot east wind blowing the sand all over your nation. But then it says in verse 9, by this then will Jacob's guilt be atoned for, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin. So here we have the idea of sin and guilt or iniquity. These are the same words that we saw in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah had the vision of Yahweh on his throne, and he realized how sinful he was. And if you remember that sermon, one of the cherubim around the throne of God takes a coal from the altar and puts it on Isaiah's lips and says, your iniquity is gone, your sin is atoned for, and then Isaiah is sent. So it's a simple image, but it's just a reminder, one of the problems is we are sinful. Okay? We are sinful and we do sin, and we think about sin. Sometimes we think about sin and manage not to do it. Often we think about sin and we do it. So that's just one of the realities. That's just a problem of life. And like I've said before, I'm guessing that most of you know that even about yourself. Okay? I know some people like to preach a lot of guilt to make sure people know that they're sinners. I'm guessing that all of you recognize that. But of course, already in that one verse, we see that God is doing something about sin to move it out of the way. Here in that verse, it's interesting because, according to that verse, because of how God punishes people in exile, then now their sin is paid for. In the bigger picture of the New Testament, of course, we understand that our sin can never truly be atoned for apart from someone paying that price. And of course, that's Jesus. Jesus who came and paid the full price. In the book of Hebrews, just emphasizes that point. One sacrifice for all sin forever. In the death of Jesus, all sin is taken away. Sin is no longer a barrier. In Isaiah, what's going on here, it's simply to say, not that now you guys have become perfect and everything is okay, but because of how God has punished his people, they're going to be able to return to the land, the temple's going to be rebuilt, and there's a chance to reestablish a relationship. Their past sin will no longer be a barrier to their present relationship with God. Okay, and that's just in anticipation of God knowing that one day his son was going to pay the full price of sin. Okay, but that's one of the images of the problem. It's the problem of sin, human choice to do the wrong thing. Big or small, it's a problem of sin. In chapter 26, there's another really weird and interesting image of human problem. And there's several things that are going on here in this section. So in chapter 26, I'm going to start at verse 14, and then we'll get to the primary image. But in verse 14, Isaiah is talking about all the rulers of those other nations, those nations that have been, kind of a plague on Israel, Assyria, and Babylon, and Egypt, and those proud rulers who are fighting against them. It says, now they are dead. They live no more. Those departed spirits do not rise. You punished them and brought them to ruin. You wiped out all memory of them. Some people are troubled by that because it sounds like, there's no resurrection. Probably Isaiah is not making a theological point about whether or not at some point, these evil people, their bodies will be resurrected for judgment or whatever. The point is just simply that they're gone and they can never trouble you again. They have no significance. Those people who had great significance in your reality, they're dead and gone, and they cannot ever trouble you again. Do not give them a second thought. The memory of them is gone. Forget about them. At the end of this passage, Isaiah is going to come back to this idea of resurrection, and it's really a powerful poetic technique. But in any case, then, Isaiah goes on. You have enlarged the nation, O Lord. You have enlarged the nation. You have gained glory for yourself. You've extended all the borders of the land. Lord, they came to you in their distress. When you disciplined them, they could barely whisper a prayer. Have you ever felt like that? Could barely whisper a prayer? You didn't know what to say to God, and you didn't even have strength, and you couldn't even pray. Have you had times when it was just hard to pray even? You didn't even have the strength. You could hardly get words out to pray. I think that's the reality for a lot of us at some time or another when even prayer is hard and hope is gone and you have no words to express what you're feeling and you wonder if anyone is even there listening and what's the point in even saying anything if no one is listening. So Isaiah just gives expression to what I think, if you've been walking with God a long time, you probably know what that feels like when you just could hardly even pray. And you wonder if there's any hope, if there's any future, if God is at all even present in your life. They could barely whisper prayer. But then there's this image that is just really, really bizarre. As a woman with child and about to give birth writhes and cries out in her pain, so were we in your presence, O Lord. We were with child, we writhed in pain, but we gave birth to wind. We have not brought salvation to the earth. We have not given birth to people of the world. Of course, he's writing about God's chosen people who were chosen precisely for the role of being a blessing to the nations. And now it's just admitting we couldn't do it, we didn't do it. And there's this image of a woman who for 9 months is pregnant. And then she goes into labor, and there's all those hours and hours of labor, especially like if it's, when our firstborn, Vasma was 27 hours in labor. It was terrible for me. It was so hard for me. But imagine 9 months of carrying the baby and the pain of labor, and then you're pushing and pushing, and come to find out there's no baby. Can you imagine that? That's this very, very strange picture that Isaiah paints of all that pain for nothing. Nothing came of it. There was no fruit. And so the second problem Isaiah talks about is not so much the problem of just that we're sinful, but it's a picture of total inability. By ourselves, we simply do not have strength to give life. On our own, we are unable to do anything, to produce anything good completely on our own. We are just unable. That doesn't say we're completely useless. It doesn't say we have gifts and abilities. We certainly do. Here in this group, they're very educated people. There's lots of gifts. It's not denying that. It's not saying you are utterly worthless. It's not saying that. It's just saying, in the end, none of us can produce life. And again, we know that in ourselves. We have this problem of sin, and we often know what's wrong. Sometimes we're able to overcome it and do the right thing. But every single one of you could probably tell a story from this last week. I couldn't quite say no to my desires, and I did this. I didn't quite have the ability to stay disciplined and produce life. I'm just not quite that strong. Okay. And so this is just this image that we're not terrible people necessarily, but we just don't quite have it to produce life. And the fruit that we actually produce is always much less than whatever effort that we have given. It's not like abundant. We're not abundantly giving life. We're not abundantly living life, and we're not abundantly giving life. There's an inability, there's an inherent weakness that we have. And I don't know how much you think about that. Maybe because I'm too analytical and too critical, but I'm, the half full, half empty kind of glass. I'm half empty kind of person, people might like a sermon, but I can always, Sunday afternoon I think almost literally every Sunday, I could have done this better, I should have said this, and I had this in my notes and I forgot that, and that would have been that's what I do. I'm never 100% satisfied with anything that I've done. I can't produce everything that's in my mind to produce. I can go into labor, so to speak, to do something, and what comes out is always less than I wanted it to be, less than it could be. I always know it could have been better. So this is just two images for how life is for us. Again, I think if we're honest, we know that that's pretty accurate. It was accurate 3,000 years ago, and it's accurate now in our experience, at least I think. Maybe Isaiah isn't describing you, but he's describing me. So there's two images of the problem, but thankfully that's not the end of the story, because there's two images of hope. There's lots of images of hope, but I want to focus on two of these images of hope. By the way, at the end of that section of this weird picture of a woman going to labor but not giving birth, suddenly it says, "But your dead will live. Their bodies will rise." All those enemies of God, they're going to count for nothing have no significance. But God's dead will live. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. We couldn't produce life, but God will produce life. God can produce life out of death. We can't raise from the dead. God can do that. Okay, the first image of hope is in chapter 25, verses 6 to 9. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. This reality that people can't quite get it, can't quite see God in what ought to be obvious to him. And it's like, it's like there is this veil over all of our minds and we can't penetrate it. So much out there. And it just says God is going to remove that. He will swallow up death forever. That, of course, is quoted in the book of Revelation at the end of the story when death itself is going to be gone. Not just the dead will rise, but then death is gone and there will be no more death. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. Again, that's quoted in Revelation. He will remove the disgrace of his people from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. So the first image of hope is this image of a banquet. Tables that God is going to lay, and he's going to cover it with food, and it's going to be the most awesome meal you can imagine. Not just wine, but the best wine, the best meats. If you're not into meat, then that's okay, because I'm sure God is going to manage to provide any kind of food you possibly want. This is an image that comes up other places in the Bible, and even in the communion or Lord's Supper. It's supposed to be that image of reminding that this God is our God. He's the kind of God who wants to put out an amazing feast for people, who wants to give that kind of gift, who wants to give joy. I mean, I think most people walking out on the street here or wherever you come from, whatever they believe about God, they don't think that about God. They don't think of God as the kind of being who wants to provide this amazing food for people's joy. The kind of God who wants to provide the best wine. But that's our God. This is the loving heart of God. That this is the future. This is a vision he has. This is what he wants to lay out for us. We who are weak and unable and sinful. He yet wants to prepare this table for his people. You might remember in the Gospel of John chapter 2, that's a story where Jesus turns water into wine. And John says, this was the first sign. What is it a sign of? It's not just a sign that Jesus is powerful. I mean, it is certainly that, to turn water into wine, that's powerful. But Jesus isn't displaying his power. What Jesus is saying is, I am now doing what God wanted to do all along. This is a sign of God's goodness. But what God promised to do back in Isaiah, he's doing now with the coming of Jesus. This prophecy is beginning to be fulfilled. He's beginning to pour out the wine. If you remember in that story, it's the best wine, and it's like, why did you save your best wine for last? You give people the best wine at the beginning, and then they've had a little bit too much to drink, and then you can, serve them almost any kind of thing. They don't even know anymore. But it's the best wine is what Jesus made. When he turns water into wine, it's the best stuff. Okay? It's not the the €3 bottles that, we get, or I get because I'm cheap. That God isn't cheap. He pours out the best for his people. I mean, the promise here, this image, is it goes beyond simple salvation or just protection. It's not just that God is protecting his people, you know, where, okay, they can just squeeze in the door with nothing, you know, and then they need to go sit in the corner because how weak and simple they are. They squeeze in the door, and lo and behold, there's this huge table and there's a seat for them. And in this passage, you've got this promise is going to come more, all peoples and all nations and all faces. Someone suggests peoples means all ethnicities. You know, I mean, right here, you know, we've got a number of different ethnicities. All of them are going to be represented. All of you have a seat at the table. Okay? There's a seat for every possible kind of person. And nations, all political, you know, entities, there's a place for them. And all faces, all individuals. And so all through this short little passage, it's all possible people can be there. There's a place available for them. There's food enough for everyone, and there's wine enough for everyone. So that's the first image that Isaiah paints, an image of hope. And it's this security that God is going to give. I mean, when I was a kid, were borderline sinful, you know, don't go, you're going to get in trouble. You know, God is going to provide the party and offer the invitation and provide everything that's needed. So that's image number 2. The second image of hope is found in chapter 27. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. And then in that day, and then there's going to be this image that I'll get to in a moment, but I want to point out something about that 27 verse 1. There's this image of Leviathan, which is kind of if people want a concrete image, it might have been like a huge crocodile in the Nile River, but back in the time of Isaiah, it was a kind of mythological beast. In Isaiah 27, you know, these different images of this serpent Leviathan, you know, could refer to Assyria and Babylon and Egypt. But all through the Bible, there's that image of a dragon or a serpent or Leviathan, and it comes out of the sea. And it's part of kind of ancient mythologies, and these are ways of talking about the enemies who have been against God from the beginning. You know, so Leviathan isn't just, you know, Assyria or Babylon. There's always a Leviathan. In the book of Revelation, the Roman Empire is Leviathan. Always a Leviathan. All through history, different empires who were a representation of forces of chaos that have always been against God. And it even has this image of the sea, and there's this image of the sea is always chaotic, and it's hard to control the sea. In the book of Revelation, you know, at the end it says, there was no more sea. You know, in the new heaven, new earth, there's no more sea. And some people read that and they're like, what does God have against the sea? You know, I like going to the beach, and, you know, does God not? It's not literal. It doesn't mean there's literally no more sea. It's a symbol to say all chaos is gone. Everything now is put into order. All the enemies of God who have been resisting God's goodness from when Satan first rebelled, and God has been in the process of overcoming this and fighting. And so you see that warfare image all through the Bible. God is fighting against the forces of evil, and he's constantly been defeating them. And they pop up in different ways, again, like the Philistines or like Assyria or Babylon. And they pop up and they're at war with God, and God overcomes them. And the Roman Empire comes up, and it's a war with God, and it presents itself as God as opposed to the real God, but it loses and it's gone. The Roman Empire is gone, and one day all the enemies will finally be defeated. So that's the image that chapter 27 starts with. You know, whatever the example of the enemies arranged against God, Each one is defeated in detail and ultimately totally defeated. But then here comes the second image of hope. Sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it day and night so that no one may harm it. I'm not angry. If only there were briars and thorns confronting me, I would march against them in battle. I would set them all on fire. Or else come to me for refuge. Let them make peace with me. Yes, let them make peace with me. That might be hard to follow that. But there's this image, in a vineyard, and briars and thorns are rising up, and they could just be pulled up and burned, but there's this interesting thing of hope. Even let the briars and thorns, if they want to turn, they too can come for refuge. If they will repent of being briars and thorns, there's going to be a place for them in my vineyard. In days to come, Jacob will take, Israel will bud and blossom and fill all the world with fruit. We've seen the image of the vine before. In fact, one of the, I guess it was the third sermon, we looked at chapter 5 and how that was used, and there's the image of chapter 5 of God planted this vineyard, and he built a wall around it and a watchtower, and he did everything that was possible for that vineyard, but there was no fruit. So in chapter 5, there's this image of judgment. You tear down the wall and so forth of this vineyard because it was worthless, useless, fruitless. There was no fruit, there was no rain, and it was abandoned, and there's thorns and briars, and it was just overrun. But now in the second image, in chapter 27, there is fruit, and God waters it every day, and it's going to be guarded. There will be no thorns and briars. In this image, even when God planted the vineyard, there's a wall around it. It protected the vineyard. The wall is going to be gone because now the vineyard, rather than being attacked, the vineyard, you might say, is going to attack the world. It's going to cover the world, and it's going to spread out. And the fruit of this vineyard is going to fill the entire earth. It's going to go over the walls and past the walls. It's going to provide fruit and blessing for the entire earth. So this is a second image of hope. What God wanted for his people in the vineyard, they were not able to produce. They didn't manage to be the people that they were intended to be, that God intended them to be. And they face the consequences of that. Nevertheless, God is faithful. God was faithful to that vineyard. And it wasn't the end of the story for that vineyard. But God intervened once again. And once again, the vineyard is going to produce life. There will be life. And once again, we just always come back to, to this image of where it looks like it's dead. It's a cut off stump of a tree and half burned, and yet, life is going to come from it. It's not quite as dead as it looked like. So we saw the problem in two images, and then hope in two images. But then for resolution of this, there's two responses that he's going to talk about. Again, actually, there could well be more, but I just want to focus on two ways in which the response required is there. But the first thing to say is that response is required. Okay? God is offering hope, but we've got to respond to it. There's a role for us. We still, have to be active in what God is providing. And one of the ways this is mentioned in chapter 25, suddenly out of the blue, when there's this praise to God, for what he's going to do, there's this image of the banquet, and then right after that image of the banquet, it says, the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, but Moab will be trampled under him, as straw is trampled down the manure. They will spread out their hands in it, as a swimmer spreads out his hands to swim. God will bring down their pride, despite the cleverness of their hands. He will bring down your high fortified walls and lay them low. He'll bring them down to the ground, to the very dust. I'm not sure exactly why Moab is singled out. Moab is one of the small kingdoms that's to the east of Israel. Different times, they might have been more or less in a decent relationship. But the idea here is even little Moab had a chance to be to be an ally, a partner with God's people. But instead of humbling themselves to do that, to take the hope that was offered, they chose to continue to live in pride that is self-sufficient and independent. We don't maybe want Israel's God. Somehow we can figure this out for ourselves. Okay, they did not respond to the offer of grace. They did not respond to the hope that was given to them. And so they lose out. In pride, they rejected the hope that was given to them. So response is necessary. But in chapter 26, verses 1 to 9, we see kind of the two response, the images of response that I want to focus on here. Chapter 26, 1 to 9. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord, Yahweh, is the rock eternal. He humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. There's been this image of the city, and sometimes it's a specific city, but the city in Isaiah just symbolizes kind of culture and civilization living apart from God. Again, sometimes it's a specific city like Nineveh or Babylon, but it can be any city, any group of people, any culture that is trying to live independently. It's that city is going to come to an end. But he's got a new city in mind for his people. But he humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. He levels it to the ground and casts it down to the dust. Feet trample it down, the feet of the oppressed, the footsteps of the poor. The path of the righteous is level. O upright one, you make the way of the righteous smooth. Yes, Lord, walking in the way of your laws, we wait for you. Your name and renown are the desire of our hearts. My soul yearns for you in the night. In the morning, my spirit longs for you. When your judgments come upon the earth, the people of the world learn righteousness. In those two verses, there's kind of two responses I just want us to think about briefly. And the first one, probably should make us feel a little bit bad and guilty, because I think it's an example where in our walk with God, we don't quite measure up. And it's what is said in verse 8. Yes, Lord, walking in the way of your laws, we wait for you. Your name and renown are the desire of our hearts. Your name, God, your honor, your glory is what our hearts most desire. And I fear, at least for me, that's often not the case. It's not that I'm, don't want God to be honored. Of course, I want him to be. But often in my walk with God, it's as much about me as it is with God. And so I'm often just, what is it that God has in mind for me? And is God going to take care of me? And am I going to have a place? Am I going to get the honor that is due me? And so we come to God to fix our problems. Now, that's not a bad move, okay? Because number one, we can't fix our problems without God. I mean, that was that previous image of inability. If we're going to get help, we've got to go to God. And however we come to him, we might as well come like that. And for a lot of us, that's our experience of, our first move to God comes out of a place of great emptiness and need. And we're coming to God because we have these needs, and we're looking to God to meet that need. Okay? And so I'm not at all saying that that's wrong. I think the reality is that does mean, it's as much about us as about God. Okay? And so this is a bit of a challenge, but part of our response is to learn for God to truly be first, and so that we're willing to say, I want God to be glorified even if my project comes to nothing. You know, I want God to be glorified even if Communitas comes to an end. Now, hopefully, we don't have to make that choice. I sure hope God wants Communitas, our church, to continue. Okay, but would we be willing to say that? If God would be most glorified if we as a community said, okay, we need to just disband as a church. And next Sunday, you had to figure out what you're going to do on Sunday morning. Would we be willing to do that if God would be most honored in that? Okay. Yeah, obviously I'm not saying I think he necessarily would, but in the end, what is the true desire of our heart? Is it truly God's honor? Or how much of that is also just our own place in the scheme? I don't have an easy fix for that, okay? I can't give you step by step. Now, if you just do these things in 2 weeks, it'll all be perfect and, God will be the biggest desire of your heart, okay? This is just a reminder of where we want to be, where we want to go, to be the kind of people where God's honor is more important than our own comfort and safety. And if God is honored in our death, would we be willing to do that? Certainly some people have been willing to make that choice. To rather die than dishonor God. So anyway, that's the first response, and I just leave that with you as a goal that we become that kind of person. But earlier in that passage, and it's a verse that I put up there, it's verses 3 and 4. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever. For the Lord, Yahweh, is a rock eternal. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, who's got a particular kind of mindset, who has disciplined his or her mind, that God is always there. God is part of reality, part of what's in our mind. And we remind ourselves that we have a God that we can trust, and that God is our life. That takes some discipline for your mind to be trained, for your eyes to be trained, that you learn to see God. Most of you know this in areas where you have some expertise, whatever it is, music or engineering or medicine or whatever it might be. When the more you're thinking about something, the more you see that. I mean, I've talked about this before and tried to illustrate it in various ways, that you see what's important to you. You look at the world differently depending on what's in your mind and what you're looking for. So the peace comes to those who discipline their minds, who practice and practice to keep God before their minds. And unfortunately, this takes discipline and practice, because the world is not going to help us here. The world out there tends not to remind us that this God is our God. So what does it take? What is it going to take for us to remind ourselves who our God is? To have a mind that is set on a particular path, eyes that are focused here. What is it going to take? I mean, I think minimally, it's going to take more than Sunday morning. I mean, even if you come for 2 hours on Sunday and you're completely focused here, that's, how many hours are in a week? Is there any good mathematician who can calculate that? 168, okay. 168 hours, 2 hours at church, then you've got 166 hours of everything else. And let me tell you, your mind is going to be set by that 166 hours more than by the 2 hours here. Even if our worship time is the most amazing worship time a church has ever experienced, history of the church. And even if my sermons are the best sermons that have ever been preached, you know, and the Apostle Paul would say, Mark, teach me how to preach. Okay, it's not like that. But even if that were true, you understand what I'm saying, it would not be enough. Okay, because there's all those other voices constantly, and everything else in the world is going to set our mind in a different direction. There's going to be constant reminders of everything else. There's trouble in the world, and that message is going to constantly come. We can't filter it out. It's going to be there. All we can do is also set our mind on something else. To make choices, you know, so that we bring God before our minds, so that we're thinking, this God is our God. I was reading this week, you know, there's constantly, you know, blogs and books written about, you know, why certain people don't go to church, why people leave church, especially why do young people leave church. You know, one of the things that the reality is a lot of times when young people go off to university, even if they grew up in church, they don't go to church too much. And so some people lose their faith not because of any reasons. No one, you know, talks to them. No professor says, you know, this is why you're stupid to be a Christian, you should believe. That's not generally how it happens. They go off to university, to a new setting, with all these other voices and other philosophies, and there's nothing wrong with that. University is good. I'm glad all of you are here in university. Most of you have been to university. It's absolutely a good thing. You know, in the Old Testament, when Daniel went to Babylon, he went to do the Babylonian University. You know, that's amazing. He went to a secular university, okay? But the point is, you've got all those other messages, and if you don't intentionally counter that with something else, you just drift. And people drift away from God without even knowing it, simply because other things in life happen. One of the things, by the way, I wanted to say that is because we've got more and more of you students who are coming every Sunday. And not because, you know, I want people to fill seats, but I'm really glad to see how faithful you guys are. You know, that's not always true of students. And in the early years of this church, we would have students come and go, and you know, they went more than they came. And so it's just, to me, it's lovely and encouraging to see you guys here every Sunday, you know, because how is that going to be true? How are you going to live in shalom and God's peace if you don't make choices about what's going on in your mind, what you fill your mind with? Okay? And so a response is required. The resolution of this, you know, the sin and the weakness with hope, you know, is going to come as we make certain choices to live in that hope, to receive that, to respond to that, to direct our heart and mind and eyes, our time to that hope. Okay? So those are kind of two responses required for resolution. So that's our three sets of two. Problem in two images, hope in two images, and then the resolution that comes in two responses. But taking another step back, you know, and looking at Isaiah 25 to 27, I want to revise the picture a little bit. There's still sin and iniquity. There's this total inability. There's still, you know, response required. But most of Isaiah 25 to 27 is all about the hope. Hope dominates that picture. And so this problem, it doesn't disappear, but its power is negated. Its power is overcome. It no longer has the significance that it had when it is overcome in hope that God provides. And our response is like being drawn to a strong magnet, or like gravity. You know, the bigger the body, the bigger the planet or whatever, the more gravitational pull it has. The bigger we exalt, how great that will on. I mean, it's what Jesus said in John chapter 12, when I'm lifted up, I'm all men to myself. Paul said it's the kindness of God that leads people to repentance. Not always. In Isaiah, Isaiah even says, even when God judges people, they don't necessarily learn. But even our response is a response to the greatness of God. He makes the first move because of our total inability, not total worthlessness, not even total depravity, if you've ever heard that term. I'm not talking about that. I don't care about that term. We're just weak enough that by ourselves we can't provide a solution. But the greatness of God bringing down a solution makes it possible that we, even in our weak and in unable hands, we can actually grasp it. It comes down close to us, and it's possible for us to receive that. This is just another picture of the gospel in Isaiah. The gospel isn't just a New Testament concept. It becomes more clear in the New Testament, but the Old Testament is full of the good news of who God is, a faithful God who's got a plan for good, and nothing thwarts his plan. Not what we provide. His plan still comes to fruition eventually, and the nations rising up against God, in the end, they're all defeated, one by one in detail, until they're all gone and there are no enemies. And we are a vineyard that fills the earth, and God provides a table for us to eat on. This God is our God. Lord, I pray that we would somehow get into our hearts and minds a picture of who you are, remind ourselves that you are faithful and you are loving and you have an incredibly good picture in mind for us, in peace, in joy, and a banquet. Help us, Lord, to trust in you, to not trust in everything else, but trust in you. Amen.